We often see the Philippines pop up in the news, right? Maybe an election headline or sometimes a natural disaster.
Mhm.
But what's actually happening politically, sort of beneath that surface level, it's often way more complex and honestly more surprising than those quick news hits suggest.
Absolutely. It's a really intricate picture.
So today we want to go beyond those headlines. We're going to really dig into the core challenges facing Philippine democracy using the source material you shared with us.
Exactly. Think of it like we're peeling back the layers, trying to understand the real forces shaping things. We're focusing on three key areas that the sources highlight.
Okay, which are?
Well, first, there's the issue of corruption. It seems pretty pervasive. Then the incredible influence of political dynasties. And finally, something vital, press freedom and the threats it faces.
Right. Corruption, dynasties, press freedom.
Yeah. The goal is to connect those dots for you, our listener, and hopefully give you a clearer, more insightful view of what's driving the political landscape there.
So we're not doing sound bites. We've waded through the source info to pull out the really crucial bits, the connections, hoping you get some real aha moments.
Let's hope so.
Okay, let's jump in. The sources start by making a really fundamental point. The Philippines is a democracy, yes, but one facing some pretty significant systemic problems.
Right. And what's really interesting, or maybe concerning, is how these problems aren't separate issues just existing side by side. They actually feed each other.
Oh, so?
Well, you have corruption, abusing power for private gain, and nepotism, favoring relatives. The sources show how these are tangled up with this phenomenon of dynastic rule. It's like a web.
It's not just about a few bad apples, then? It's more structural.
Exactly. It's about how power itself can get concentrated among, well, a relatively small number of families and their allies.
And the consequence of that concentration, the sources seem pretty clear on this.
Yeah, it can lead to deeper inequality, a lack of social justice. I mean, when a few families hold the reins that tightly, what happens to everybody else's voice? It gets harder to be heard.
And this concentration of power, it can shift the government's priorities, right?
That's a key point. Instead of focusing on the needs of the whole population, the system might start, maybe unintentionally, maybe not, prioritizing the interests of the powerful.
And often at the expense of who?
Well, often marginalized communities. We're talking indigenous groups, farmers, the urban poor. They can end up feeling left out without real representation.
And there's actually data backing this up, isn't there? That Transparency International report.
Yes, the 2023 one. It's quite stark, actually. The Philippines ranked 115th out of 180 countries on their Corruption Perceptions Index.
115th. Wow, that suggests a serious level of public distrust, doesn't it?
It really does. It points to this widespread feeling, this perception, that corruption isn't just isolated incidents, but a deep-rooted problem within the institution.
And that kind of perception, that lack of faith, that must damage the foundations of democracy itself.
Absolutely. When people lose trust that their leaders are acting in the public interest or that the system is fundamentally fair, it can really impact everything. Civic engagement, political stability, the whole health of the democracy.
Okay, let's zoom in on one of those core issues you mentioned, the political dynasties. The source material really emphasizes these as a defining feature of Philippine politics.
Oh, definitely. It's not just about families having some influence for a bit. We're talking about a really persistent grip on political power, often stretching across generations.
And the sources name names, right? Like the big ones.
Yeah, they mention families like the Marcoses, the Aquinos, the Duterte's names
Yeah.
that are almost inseparable from major chapters in Philippine history. You recognize them immediately.
There was that study, too, Ateneo School of Government. The numbers were pretty staggering.
That's right, the 2019 study. It found that, get this, 80%, 80% of elected officials between 1969 and 2019 came from these dynastic clans.
80%. That just paints such a clear picture of how dominant these families are.
It really does. And you have to wonder, what does that kind of dominance do to the system?
Well, how does it affect things?
The sources suggest it can really stifle democratic competition and debate. When the same families control so much political territory for so long, it gets incredibly hard for new voices, new leaders, without those connections, to even get a foothold.
So it crowds out fresh perspectives.
It can, yeah. It potentially limits the dynamism you want in a healthy democracy. You risk having the same conversations, the same interests, recycled over and over.
And the sources suggest the priorities of these dynasties might not align with the public good.
That's a major concern raised. If a dynasty's main goal becomes, say, personal enrichment, or just clinging to power, those interests can easily overshadow the real needs of ordinary people like those farmers, indigenous groups, or the urban poor we mentioned earlier.
It sounds like a cycle. Power helps corruption. Corruption helps cement power.
That's kind of the loop, yes. Entrenched power can create opportunities for corruption, and the wealth or influence gained from that can then make the dynasty even stronger, making reforms harder to achieve.
Okay, so let's talk more directly about corruption then. The sources describe it as, well, pervasive. Everywhere.
Yeah, that's the picture painted. Not just high-level scandals, but something that potentially affects many different layers of government, and that constant drip, drip, drip really erodes public trust.
And you mentioned the link back to the dynastic elites.
Right. The idea is that their networks, their influence, can sometimes contribute to a culture where accountability is weak. If powerful people seem untouchable.
Then others might think they can get away with things too.
Exactly. It can foster this environment where corruption is maybe seen as less risky or prosecution seems less likely, especially if you're connected.
The source material gives a historical example, a really big one. Ferdinand Marcos Sr.
Yes, a huge example. The estimates of wealth amassed during his rule, potentially through corrupt means, are just staggering. We're talking $5 billion to $10 billion.
Billions. It's almost hard to comprehend that scale.
It really is. And what's striking, as the source points out, is that much of that wealth was never recovered.
And the family.
Well, members of the Marcos family have continued to hold significant political office in the years since.
Right. It really shows the staying power of these dynasties and how hard accountability can be.
It highlights that long shadow. Absolutely. Justice and recovery can be incredibly difficult processes when dynastic power is so resilient.
Which naturally leads us to talk about some of these controversial figures, specifically Ferdinand Marcos and Rodrigo Duterte. Their legacies are intensely debated.
They really are. And the sources suggest you can't understand the Philippines today without grappling with those legacies. For Marcos Sr., beyond the alleged corruption, there are the documented human rights abuses under martial law.
The numbers there are also stark.
Yeah, reports mention things like 70,000 arrests, maybe 34,000 torture cases. It's a very dark period in the country's history.
And yet, despite all that, his son, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., won the presidency in 2022.
Which is quite remarkable, isn't it? It speaks volumes about that dynastic resilience we were just talking about, how these families can navigate even very difficult historical contexts and return to power.
Then there's Rodrigo Duterte. His presidency, 2016 to 2022, also generated huge controversy, especially internationally.
Primarily because of the war on drugs, yes. There was widespread condemnation over the approach, with human rights groups reporting thousands killed, often, allegedly, without due process.
Over 6,000 deaths reported by Human Rights Watch alone, the source notes.
That's right, a truly shocking figure.
Yeah.
And beyond the drug war, there were also allegations during his term about economic issues.
Like mismanagement, cronyism.
Yeah, those accusations were definitely present, favoring political allies or friends in business deals, that sort of thing. Criticisms about how the economy was handled.
And like the Marcoses, the Duterte family's influence continues, right?
Very much so. His daughter, Sarah Duterte, is a major political figure currently. There's often talk about her own potential future ambitions for national leadership.
So again, that pattern of family influence persisting across administrations.
Exactly. It's a recurring theme in the political narrative the sources describe.
Okay, let's shift to the third key area, press freedom. This is fundamental to any democracy, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. A free, independent press is supposed to be the watchdog, holding power accountable. But this source material raises some serious red flags about the situation in the Philippines.
What kind of red flags?
Well, a major one was the shutdown of ABS-CBN back in 2020. This wasn't some small outlet. It was a huge broadcaster.
And this happened under Duterte's administration.
Yes, and it was widely interpreted by press freedom advocates and others as retaliation for the network's critical reporting. It sent a real chill through the media landscape.
A message, perhaps. Don't criticize too much.
That was certainly the concern, that it was an attempt to curb scrutiny, to limit those democratic checks and balances that a free press provides.
There was also the case involving Maria Ressa.
Right, the Nobel laureate journalist. Her conviction for cyber libel in 2020, though it was thankfully overturned later in 2023, was seen as another example of the legal pressures journalists could face.
Just for doing their jobs, essentially.
That was the argument. These kinds of cases, even if eventually overturned, can create a climate of fear, potentially leading to self-censorship. Journalists might hesitate to cover sensitive topics.
And the international rankings reflect this. Reporters Without Borders.
They do. The source mentions their 2024 ranking, which placed the Philippines way down at 134th globally for press freedom.
134th. That's quite low. It suggests a serious problem.
It really does. It indicates a significant perceived erosion of media freedom and independence.
And connecting this back, if the press is weakened or intimidated, what does that mean for corruption and accountability?
Well, it makes it much harder to fight them, doesn't it? If journalists can't investigate and report freely on potential abuses of power or corruption scandals without fear of reprisal.
Then those things can flourish in the shadows.
Exactly. It weakens a key mechanism for transparency and holding powerful figures, including those from dynastic families, accountable for their actions.
So we've unpacked these interconnected issues. Corruption, dynasties, threats to the press. It sounds quite challenging. Where do things go from here? Do the sources offer any sense of a path forward?
They acknowledge the complexity, definitely. There are no easy answers, but they emphasize the importance of, well, facing these truths head on if change is going to happen.
You can't fix problems you don't acknowledge.
Precisely. And understanding how these issues, corruption fueling dynasties, a restricted press hiding both are linked, is crucial. You often can't tackle one without addressing the others.
What role do ordinary citizens play in this, according to the sources?
A vital one. The sources point to the need for citizens to demand more transparency from their government, to actively support independent media outlets.
The ones doing the tough reporting.
Exactly. And also to advocate for actual reforms, laws, and policies that could potentially limit the dominance of these long-standing political dynasties.
But that's a tall order, isn't it? Especially given the resilience of figures like the Marcoses and Dutertes that we've discussed.
It absolutely is. The sources don't downplay the obstacles. These are deeply entrenched power structures we're talking about, with significant resources and established networks. Change is never easy in that context.
Is there any optimism in the source material?
There's maybe a cautious note. The suggestion is that increased public awareness, a deeper public understanding of these systemic issues, can eventually build pressure for change.
So knowledge is power, in a sense.
That's the hope, I think, that a more informed and engaged citizenry can, over time, push for a political system that's more accountable, more equitable, and more truly representative.
But it hinges on people engaging.
Ultimately, yes. The future path depends a lot on the willingness of Filipinos to critically examine these realities and actively work towards building that better system.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive today, drawing from the source material, the main threads are pretty clear.
Mm.
We've seen how Philippine politics is deeply shaped by, one, this persistent challenge of corruption, two, the incredible staying power and influence of political dynasties, and three, these concerning pressures on press freedom.
Right. And these aren't just abstract concepts. They have real-world consequences for justice, for equality, for the country's overall progress.
Absolutely. And it's really important for you listening to think about how these big picture issues connect, how they affect the lives of ordinary people and shape the prospects for democracy in the Philippines.
It's all deeply interconnected.
So here's a final thought we want to leave you with, something to chew on. In a political system like the one described, where power seems so concentrated and so entrenched, sometimes for generations, what do you think are the most effective ways, the most sustainable ways for citizens to actually push for genuine, lasting democratic reforms?
It's a really tough question. No easy answers.
Definitely something worth